A cut tent, gruesome injuries, radiated clothes, orange skin, and a camera capturing one last blurry flash of light. In 1959, the Mountain of the Dead claimed 9 souls, and the legend of the Dyatlov Pass Incident was born. However, according to the Russian officials, the case has now been marked as solved and closed. But what if the truth lies elsewhere? And there is still more to be discovered. Let's dive in. Up in the Ural Mountains in Russia is a place known to the native Mansi people as Kholat Syakhl. This translates to Mountain of the Dead, which is very fitting considering its history. And there's this one particular incident that has made headlines all over the world over the last 60 years. And since it has been labeled as one of the world's greatest mysteries. But the official records now say that this puzzle has been solved. There are many inconsistencies that keep reappearing though, and so it seems that his so-called official explanation is nothing but a cover-up for something much bigger the Russians don't want us to know about. So, what could it be? And will we ever get to the bottom of this world's most haunting mystery? In late January of 1959, 9 experienced Soviet hikers, 7 men and 2 women, set out into this frozen land. They were led by the 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov, who was a radio engineering student from the Ural Polytechnic Institute in Sverdlovsk. All members were these seasoned trekkers, and they were actually aiming to earn their Grade 3 hiking certification, which is the highest rank you could get awarded in the Soviet Union at the time. Dyatlov proposed this route that would take them deep into the Ural Mountains through an area where the cold was absolutely unforgiving, and so he knew that the group could not afford to make any mistakes while they were out there. But the team's journey started without trouble. They kept diaries, took photos, and documented each leg of their adventure. And even their last entries were very upbeat. You can see them smiling faces, posing by their skis and laughing, completely unaware that they were walking into one of the most chilling and controversial mysteries of the 20th century. By February 1st, they had reached the slopes of the mountain. The group were really pleased with how well their trip has gotten so far, but they also realized that they had a decision to make. They were currently on a very exposed mountainside, and so pitching a tent right there would be considered a bad idea. But if they were to descend into a more sheltered forest area a little further down, they would lose some of the precious altitude they had gained, and so would actually feel like they were going backwards. Also, the group was pretty tired at this point because the trek had been a hard work, so after a bit of a back and forth, the group did decide to stay right there where they were and pitch a tent there. Unfortunately, it would seem that this very decision would be the reason their lives were cut so short. When the group failed to return, a search party was launched. But what the rescuers would find would spark decades of speculation, scientific inquiry, conspiracy theories, and pure horror. The search began on February 20th, almost 3 weeks after the hikers were due back. And it was actually students and teachers from the Ural Polytechnic who first pressed the government to act. So it was really their joint efforts that forced the military and volunteer rescue teams into action, hoping of having a chance of finding that missing expedition. On February 26th, searchers spotted a partially buried tent protruding from a slope on the mountain, and what they found chilled them. The tent was cut open from within, with multiple slashes that cut through the thick canvas. It seemed like it had been slashed in panic, almost as if the hikers were trying to escape something quickly. Their boots, gear, and food were still left behind, as if they had no time to pack or even dress. The searchers quickly found footprints leading away from the tent, and many of these were barefoot, and only a couple were indicating that they were either wearing a sock or even just one shoe. But these tracks, which were still clearly visible in the frozen snow, showed no signs of struggle. There were no signs of wild animals, it was just these 9 pairs of footprints leading away from the camp. But this makes no sense. The way the tent had been left behind suggested that the group tried getting away from something in a panic, but then once they were out, they suddenly calmed down and just walked away. These footprints stretched downhill into the forest before vanishing beneath the snow. And then, a kilometer away, at the edge of a tree line, the first 2 bodies were found, near the remains of a fire, and these were Yuri Krivoshenko and Yuri Doroshenko. Both men were stripped to their underwear, and they were found lying under a cedar tree. Branches above them had been broken, suggesting someone tried either climbing in a panic or were looking for something. And their hands were badly burned, most likely by staying too close to the fire they had made. It was ruled that both men died of hypothermia, which could explain why they were not wearing any clothes. This is usually referred to as paradoxical undressing, and people have been observed to remove their clothes because they actually feel too hot rather than cold when the temperature drops too low. And this of course would speed the rate at which you lose heat, and ultimately it can lead to your death. After this sad discovery, 3 more bodies were found. Not too far away, rescuers found the body of Igor Dyatlov lying on his back with his fists clenched, facing forward the tent. Zina Komolgorova was further up the slope, her body twisted as though she crawled uphill through the snow. And Rostom Slobodin lay nearby, face down. He had a fractured skull, but oddly enough, this injury wasn't fatal. Instead, he, just like the others, too froze to death. But then came the final and most gruesome discovery. 2 months later, after the snow melted down enough to reveal the edge of a ravine, the remaining 4 hikers were finally located. Lyudmila Dubinina, Semyon Zolotaryov, Alexander Kolevatov, and Nikolai Thibeaux-Reynolds were all found in a snow-filled ravine, and it would be their bodies that showed the most severe damage. Interestingly though, they were better dressed than the others. They were wearing the clothes of their dead companions, suggesting some survived longer and tried to adapt. It is even believed that they built this den out of old clothes and branches so that they could have been kept out of the cold snow. But ultimately, even these trekkers would not escape their death. And their injuries were the most horrific. Thibeaux-Reynolds had a smashed skull, massive internal bleeding, but no external wounds. Zolotaryov and Dubinina had broken ribs, and Dubinina's chest was described as crushed. Her tongue was gone, her eyes were missing, and parts of her lips were torn away. The autopsy claimed it happened after death, but some aren't so sure. Zolotaryov was found clutching a pen and notebook, but those pages were completely empty. Kolevatov, the last, had neck trauma and facial deformation. The bodies had orange-tinted skin, and even traces of radiation were found on their clothing. It all looked as if some invisible force had flung them into the ravine, crushing them on impact. But no avalanche debris was found, and the slope wasn't even steep enough for a full snowslide. The Soviet investigation into the case was swift, but it also did not provide any proper answers or explanation. The investigation, led by Lev Ivanov, concluded that a compelling natural force was responsible for all of this. No other details were provided though, and the case was sealed and its files were classified. The silence of the Soviet state only deepened the mystery further. Witnesses were pressured, autopsy detail vanished, and the area was quietly declared off-limits for years. Families were left with no closure though, and everyone began asking the questions of what force could terrify 9 people into fleeing barefoot into the night and leave some of them broken like ragdolls. Of course, all sorts of theories would soon emerge. There were talks of an avalanche, military tests, secret weapons, infrasound, even extraterrestrial contact. But in 1959, no one could speak openly about these possibilities, at least not without risking exile or worse. The official line was clear: the hikers died due to nature. But some in that cold, buried tent felt too precise, too sudden, and too wrong. But the world was not ready to let it go. The Dyatlov Pass Incident has become one of the most dissected mysteries in modern history. For decades, people have combed through autopsy reports, diaries, photographs, and even laid their hands on highly declassified documents. This means that many theories have emerged, and while some sound plausible, others not so much. But before we dive into them, I would love if you subscribed, because if you do, you'll get videos like this one delivered straight into your notifications, and it'll also show me that you enjoy my videos. One of the most widely accepted scientific explanation is that an avalanche drove the group from their tent, which incidentally is what the Russians labeled it as the official cause. Now, it might explain the panic, the rushed escape, and even some of the crushing injuries suffered by a few of the hikers. But then on the other hand, some of the more disturbing injuries could not have been caused by an avalanche. Critics also point out to several other problems. First, no avalanche debris was ever found. The slope of the mountain was also not steep enough for a classic slide to happen. And then you also have to remember that the tent was partially still standing, which absolutely would not have happened if the avalanche did cause all of this. And most importantly, the footprint trail was still undisturbed, which again, if avalanche did strike, it would have completely obliterated it. And then what about the radiation traces? There must have been a clear source for this, but there's no mention of this anywhere. A 2021 study from Swiss researchers, inspired by the simulations used in Disney's Frozen, proposed a new type of avalanche, and this was supposed to be a delayed slab avalanche caused by snow loading and weak layering. Now, this could explain the crushing injuries without external wounds, but even that doesn't explain the strange behavior of the hikers. Why would they have the need to run so far, so poorly clothed? And then they wouldn't return when the danger had passed? And what about their orange skin? This again would not happen on its own, so what caused it? I think we can agree that if avalanche did happen, and it mysteriously did not leave any traces behind, it definitely did not manage to kill all of the hikers. But then, what did? Another natural explanation could be katabatic winds. This would be this very cold, dense air that rushes down the slopes with force similar to hurricane. Now, such winds would have collapsed the tent or made staying in the place impossible, and its noise and power might have induced a panic. But these events are quite rare and very unpredictable. And again, they wouldn't explain the massive internal injuries, radiation, or even why they ran instead of relocating the camp. Some people propose that a rare atmospheric phenomenon, known as the Kármán vortex thread, caused infrasound to resonate in the area. These low-frequency vibrations can cause nausea, unease, and even irrational panic. And so could infrasound have driven the hikers into the night, thinking there was imminent danger when there was none? It is possible, but it yet again doesn't explain physical trauma or radiation. Of course, there have been talks about the hikers being attacked by someone or something. The local indigenous Mansi people were initially suspected of this because the hikers were actually trespassing on their sacred land. But there was no evidence of struggle or weapons. In fact, the Mansi helped in the search, and so this theory had largely been dismissed. The same has actually gone for animal attacks, because again, there were no clear signs of this. And animals don't cause internal injuries without visible trauma, nor would it explain why the group left in such a coordinated way. And also, what about the radiation? There was even this one theory proposed by Igor Povetkin, who examined the case, and he said that the group could have been run over by a snowmobile. This would explain some of the more violent injuries. But again, it is not completely foolproof, and it would not take into consideration the radiation and the orange skin. There's this other theory that persisted for decades, and that is the possibility that the group stumbled upon some secret Soviet weapons tests, such as parachute mines, radiation experiments, or chemical dispersal. The injuries would be consistent with blast trauma, and the area was near missile test zones. And more importantly, it would even provide a clear link to the radiation traces that have been found. And the Soviet secrecy only fuels this theory further. Files were dismissed, witnesses were silenced, strange lights in the sky were reported in the region around the same time. So it could be that the hikers were caught in the deadly accident, and it could have been later covered up. Personally, this sounds like the most plausible of the events, before delving into the paranormal territory. And speaking of, some believe the hikers saw or encountered something otherworldly. UFO sightings were reported nearby, and their last photograph is this blurred image that some interpret as this bright object in the sky. Others suggest supernatural causes like a yeti or something more ancient and hostile. And these would of course support the radioactive elements, scorched trees, and the grisly injuries. But the evidence is too ambiguous, and also it is easily twisted. So while chilling, these theories are built on more fear than fact, and without clear evidence, these will most likely never be taken too seriously, at least not by the majority of people. Every explanation has holes: nature, madness, science, or secrets. Each could explain part of what happened, but none can really explain everything. And that's the heart of the Dyatlov mystery. It just keeps resisting closure. Now, more than 60 years have passed, but time hasn't dulled the fascination. If anything, the mystery of the Dyatlov Pass Incident has only grown. The case has become the subject of dozens of documentaries, books, podcasts, and even films. In 2019, the Russian government reopened the case. And that wasn't because of new evidence has emerged, but they wanted to finally squash the rampant speculations. And their conclusion was pointing to this avalanche triggered above the hikers, who then had to leave their tent in a hurry, barely clothed. And just like that, the Russians considered this case closed. But as you can imagine, people have not really been satisfied with this so-called explanation. While of course an avalanche could have happened, it just felt too tidy and too convenient. It is also probably what most people would associate a mountain incident with. But we just kind of forget and ignore the psychological terror the hikers went through. Their injuries were too violent and rather unique in some cases to be associated with an avalanche. Also, what about the found traces of radiation? Those make no sense. There would need to be a clear trigger for that. But what was it? Let's also not forget the military angle. This zone was for some time declared as a no-fly zone, and we have records of other incidents that happened around the same area, also involving the same number of hikers, 9. The group could have also been mistaken for Gulag fugitives and would be killed on sight, and of course this would be then covered up. But even now, there are still so many independent researchers and citizens investigators out there who continue to chase the truth. Expeditions return to Dyatlov Pass year after year. New technologies like ground-penetrating radar and forensic modeling have provided more insight. But so far, we still have not had one definitive answer as to what had really happened to those hikers. And more importantly, why? Apart from all those more rational theories, there are always the ones with more haunting elements. And many people believe that the Dyatlov Pass incident can never be explained because of a huge cover-up which is shielding the public from knowing what is really going on in those mountains. Some even call it the Russian Area 51. And so if we're not meant to know the truth, we never will. And so the story of the Dyatlov Pass incident has become a cultural ghost. It represents everything we fear about nature, isolation, and the unknown. It tells us that even experienced people in a modern age can vanish in moments, and that a force, be it natural or not, can still defy explanation. Friends and families of those 9 hikers still seek answers, but there are very few left. Yuri Yudin, who was supposed to be the 10th hiker but in the end had to turn back because of his illness, said that he needed to know the truth because he helped choose those people and they were all his friends. Unfortunately, Yuri died in 2013 without ever getting to the bottom of this mystery. Each year, memorials are held in Russia and flowers are laid at the base of the mountain. The Dyatlov Pass incident endures not because of what we know, but because of what we don't. And that is probably what scares us the most. But what do you think happened that night back in 1959? Let me know in the comments, and be sure to watch this next video, which also contains a puzzling mystery. Until next time.